Good evening. Uh, Welcome to our meeting about coronavirus. My name is Pedro Videla. I'm talking to you from our IESE campus in Barcelona. Today we are going to have two sessions in one. In the first hour we were going to analyze the macro aspect of the coronavirus. In the second half we will have four IESE professors that will analyze what companies should do to face this virus. What are the main type of decision and policy they have to take in order to minimize the impact of the virus at the company level. Some organizations information first. We have people in WebEx and we have people in LinkedIn, and also we have some few people that are here with us in the live audience in this room. So if you want to send us a question, please send it to us through LinkedIn or WebEx, and here I will collect them in the first hour. Then Professor Mike Rosenberg will do it in the second hour, and we will have a Q&A at the end of each of the sections. We will start at the beginning, the first hour, to talk about the macro view. And we have here with us Axel Lambert. Axel, it's an MBA from 2001. When I saw him for the first time, he was not like this big guy that is now that they are in class. He's a microbiologist. Before he was at the French Ministry of Health, assessing the preparedness and response to health crisis. So he was working at the Ministry of Health, and now he's an independent expert in the same field. So we brought here an expert to see how to be prepared at the macro level of this type of health crisis. Axel will talk for 20-25 minutes. He has a presentation and we'll set up the issue. And then I will talk for another 15 minutes about the economic impact that this crisis is having and might have in this time of uncertain times. And then we will collect your Q&As. So please ask all the questions that you want. We will try to answer in the first hour we try to answer all your questions. So Axel, welcome to your home again. Welcome to IESE. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pedro, and I thank you very much for inviting me tonight. It's an honor, it's a pleasure. I'm very happy to help, and very thankful for my former professor of economics. I don't know if I remembered that much from what he told me, but we will see. I wanted to start this session with a little quiz, which is not about coronavirus, by the way, not directly at least. So, do you remember, and you certainly do, an event that on the 11th of September 2001 in New York, 3,000 people lost their lives in the Twin Towers attack? Nobody, I don't need to ask you, nobody has forgotten those facts and those numbers. Now, the second question I would want to ask you in the quiz, and you can raise your hand, either in your imagination or in the audience, if you know what I'm talking about. 2 years later, so in 2003, which event caused 70,000 deaths in Europe, of which 15,000 were in France? Hands? So nobody remembers the heat wave of the summer of 2003, right? In the same year, a bit earlier, in fact, in the same year, there was an event that affected the whole world. It affected 8,000 people. It killed about 800, and you may remember this one a little bit better now. Any clue? That event was SARS, the previous coronavirus epidemic. And so what I wanted to do with this little quiz is to look at the economic impact of those three events, which were undoubtedly crisis. So, as I've just said, the first event, 2001, 9/11, 2001, the 9/11 attacks. 2003, that was the SARS epidemic, and 2003 again was 70,000 people died in France, in Europe, of a heat wave. So, if we look at the economic impact of those three events, we can separate the direct economic effects and the indirect economic effect. The direct economic effects I've detailed on that slide. The direct is effectively the immediate impact. So the death and the injury of people, the material destructions, if you talk about 9/11, this is very obvious. The job losses, people that lost their job at the time, a staggering 200,000 people lost their job in Manhattan on 9/11, after 9/11. The cost of care, of taking care of the victims, the firefighters, etc., and cost for decontamination. The indirect economic impact is effectively what those events have induced in the economy. So the loss of productivity, when a lot of people die, depending on what age they are, but of course those are many years of productive life that are lost. Also, and we're seeing some things like that today, closing borders, restricting travel, cancelling flights, all those have actually a very significant impact, and Pedro will certainly talk about it later on. And above all, there's a feeling, the loss of confidence, lower growth, decreased investment, tourism is in the doldrums, the cost of insurance gets bigger, and also there is a cost at the level of the state, because there are interventions in terms of fiscal policy or monetary policy that also actually have a cost. So if you look at that and you put it against against the technology loss, where do I point? Where is this? So yeah, technology will always.
Now might be there.
No, I can. Okay.
Let me help you. Well,
can you press the button? Maybe
yes, I can press the button for you. So this doesn't move here either.
I mean, that is the one slide which there we are.
There
Thank you. So you can see that the direct cost of 9/11 are very high. It's $68 billion, okay? And the indirect costs are much higher at $190 billion. And you could debate for quite some time, what is in those costs, etc. But this is not the point I want to make. The direct cost of SARS was, in terms of macroeconomic level, rather limited. The indirect costs, so effectively the economic impact rather than the direct costs, right, were very high indeed as well. And if you look at the heat wave, it is not noticeable as far as the economy is concerned. Okay, so what I want to look at, of course, in the point which I'm trying to make here, is now what is the link? It is quite obvious that there is no correlation between the number of victims and the economic damage. 70,000 people dying in the middle of Europe, actually it's dramatic, it's an enormous loss of life, but economically speaking, it does not correlate. So I ask myself, well, what does correlate with economic impact of such crisis? And this is one thing which we can look at. So that effectively the economic impact of a crisis is proportional to the surprise factor, to the loss of confidence, to the fear that is induced by the event. 9/11 shocked all of us, and we all remember it, and this is why this is seared into our memories. We know about this, we've heard about it, fine. And SARS was pretty scary at the time as well. We may have forgotten slightly about this. And so that is what I suggest is the link. So to sum up this point, there are serious economic shocks which are caused by by health crisis. And today, in the coronavirus example, this is already very obvious. All the stock markets are tanking. There's a lot of confidence, a lot of travel. People stop traveling, etc., etc. But the economic impact has nothing to do with the number of victims itself. Okay, it is proportional to fear, anxiety, loss of trust. It is unfamiliar. Why are we scared of coronavirus? It ticks most of the boxes for a health crisis that actually registers very high on the radar of the public health authorities. When we see weak signals, like early January this year, it ticks the boxes whether this is contagious, it's a virus. There are actually a number of fatalities. There are a lot of uncertainties. We don't know what is happening. All this increases the fear. There is only one box that coronaviruses does not tick in this particular one. To raise it, that would raise the fear factor even more, is the fact that it does not affect children and the youth. Because, of course, anything that affects children, including our own, of course, increases the level of the level of fear. So, if we take this this observation here, I think that one point which I want to make is that the number of victims is not a relevant indicator as far as economic impact is concerned. And so in this case, today, in this crisis, the death toll, we are being bombarded with the death toll. Even serious newspaper send you a notification 3-4 times a day. So many new cases, so many new countries. Bam, 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 bam. We are bombarded with this indicator, and this indicator is simply not relevant for decision making if you are trying to manage your business, if you're trying to ride out or effectively mitigate the effect of this crisis from a corporate point of view. Looking at the death rate, or what we technically call the case fatality ratio, is even more misleading, because there you're looking at the number of deaths and you divide it by the number of cases. That seems simple enough, except that there's a dynamic in an epidemic which induces effectively statistical aberration in this, because the number of so your numerator, you may or may not know it, may or may not be precise, but the denominator, so cases and deaths over cases, the cases, first of all, the number you will have depends on how many people you test. It will depend on how many people who are sick today, but the people that died today caught it 3 weeks ago. So it's at a different point. It's a different dynamic, and so this is very confusing. Even health professionals at this point in the crisis, take this indicator with a lot of precaution. And it's the last thing you want is actually, and I've heard people recently using this to make cataclysmic, prediction about the final number of deaths. Now, this is a number that we will know for sure at the end of the crisis. That also means it's not very useful today in what we are trying to achieve. Of course, it makes sense to watch it for public health. Now, this bombardment with death toll, all those numbers, all those countries, all this media does increase anxiety, but it does not increase your level of useful information. So one recommendation I would have is turn off the Corona TV show, right? It is not actually helping. It is not very very useful. So all this news actually has one effect, which is quite. It doesn't increase your the quality of your decision. It does not increase your level of information. But what it does increase is the anxiety and the nervousness, right? That we all feel. It's quite normal to be concerned, to fear. So, what should I do? And as we learn in business school, every business school teaches about decision analysis, right? And decision making, why do we need to teach decision analysis? Because we make mistakes when we take decisions. Now, the biases, or so-called heuristics, all those phenomena that actually influence the way we take decisions, quite a few of those biases actually get amplified by the anxiety. So anxiety makes you take worse decisions than if you are a bit more. It also increases the bias in the perception of risk. Okay, so in normal times, the perceived risk of dying from something that you would have in the general population is actually quite decorrelated with the actual risk, perceived risk versus actual risk. People tend to put too much weight on the sort of risk to your life that gets reported in the media. You can just imagine what it's doing now. Okay, so an interesting observation also is that the sort of biases in the general population about the risk of dying of something is reflected in the number of time that such events get reported in the press. Now, do we have those biases because we read it from the media, or is it that the media actually are written by human beings that suffer from the same bias? I don't actually know, but it doesn't matter. But clearly, the differential between the real risk and the perceived risk is something that gets amplified. Fear and anxiety also increases the short-term perception. I mean, looking at the short term, what I wrote on the slide as being myopia, or hypnosis with the number. We look at what is exactly in front of us. It's an acquired way of thinking. It serves us very well in a number of circumstances. If the house is burning, your priority is the immediate concern. Get out of the house, right? And you will think later about your insurance policy. And so that is why, as human beings, we have evolved to actually, in a crisis situation, to actually look on the other first term. It makes a lot of sense. In this case, it actually doesn't work quite so well, because we tend to look at the last news report from CNN, from Al Jazeera, from France 24, or whatever, and have this fascination, hypnosis. So another one of those biases in decision making is herd behavior, basically also called social confirmation of action. If I see somebody if I'm thinking of doing something, and I see somebody else doing it, then actually this confirms that this is the right thing to do. It leads to behavior such as people raiding supermarket shelves, and it's the same mechanism in the stock market, by the way. So, raiding the supermarket shelves is. I personally have my first recollection of this phenomena from 1991. It was the first Gulf War. It was in Iraq. I was living in London, and people were storing, pasta in London. Now, in retrospect, this looks quite ridiculous. Now, think now a little bit. How will we interpret our actions today in 6 months' time? When the coronavirus will be in a different phase. It will be over, it will be mild, something will have happened. I think this is a mental exercise that can actually help us stop focusing on the short term and actually take a longer view. And this will help us in how we manage our companies, our jobs, our lives. Speaking of the risk perception, there is another common bias in decision making, which is seeking confirmation for belief that you are previously hold. In the last few weeks, I have spoken to quite a lot of people who called me up to seek my advice, basically, on the coronavirus crisis. And not all of them, but there was a proportion of those people who were effectively only asking to confirm the scenario they already had in mind. So they say, so they were the over-optimistic people who said, please tell me that this is no big deal. Please tell me that it's not worse than the flu. Please tell me that it's going to be all right. And the others were over-pessimistic and saying, well, if we take that death rate and multiply it by the world population, then it's going to be a catastrophe of biblical dimension, right? Which I refuse to do. I refuse to confirm those things because both are seeking confirmation of their scenario and they're selecting data according to that. And this is a bias we have to be careful about. And I'm not confirming either. Why? Because this is a serious crisis. There is no doubt about it, right? But how severe it will be will depend on our individual and collective behavior. So if there is a change to be made, it is also by you, by your action in your companies, by your actions as a citizen, as an individual, and this is what governments are doing now. To summarize, the situation in the world, we can say that there are countries with an active epidemic. We know which one those are: China, Iran, Italy, South Korea. Those are the countries battling an epidemic, which an active and dynamic epidemic. There is another set of countries where there are sporadic clusters of transmission of the virus, and the third part is the country where the virus has not arrived yet. Now, the countries in the middle, what are they doing now? On the one hand, they are preparing the hospital sector so that the hospital sector is ready, or as ready as possible, when the epidemic, actually takes a bigger size, basically. That is what they can do, from the government point of view. They can also, cancel mass events, cancel football matches, etc. We have seen that, and more stringent quarantine measures. Right. This is one part that they're doing, but the other part, which is being done also, is in fact sending the message out that there are measures which can be taken individually that actually will make a difference. And you have seen those messages. Cough in your elbow, right? Not in your hand. Wash your hands frequently. Don't shake hands. I know it's difficult. I spent the day here at IESE in Barcelona. I saw a lot of old friends. And the temptation, of course, is, how good to see you. And it is hard, but frankly, is it so hard that we are not willing to do that to actually preserve, the vulnerable people in society in a few weeks' time? Because when the epidemic arrives, if we have done our things and the governments have done their things, right, then the epidemic wave, instead of having an epidemic peak, with a lot of people being sick at the same time and saturating the health system, then even if we have the same number of cases, they will be spread over a longer period of time, right? Because the spread will have been slowed down by what we can do, right? And then the hospital services won't be saturated, and everybody can get the health care that they deserve in a healthy and rich countries such like we're living in. So I think there is there is the thing we can do. Sneezing, coughing, stop shaking hands. Teach your kids to do the same, right? And as business leaders, I think there's on top of that, I mean, what you want to do is create an environment that is safe for employees to actually report sick. You know, that they don't have a doubt that they can pick up the phone and say, you know what, it's certainly not coronavirus, but I have some fever and I'm coughing a little bit, and maybe it's better if I don't show up to work today. And then the answer must be, yes, this is what we expect you to do, right? Because if you come to work, you're coughing, you have a fever, if you contaminate, this is bad for you, this is bad for the company, and this is bad for society. So this would be the practical advice that I would to that. And basically, to finish off, if I would say more things about what we can practically do when you're managing this at company level, there is so much information out there that you may want to stop and think for a minute about what information do you really need. Select, let's say, 3 sources of information, maybe no more, and go actively find the information that you need rather than having all sorts of information thrown at you, trying to drink from a fire hose, right? The second thing I would advise is determine which indicator you actually need to manage this crisis in your business, and look at that. It does not necessarily need to be a numerical indicator, but I can tell you the death toll is not one that you should use because it's not bringing you much information. And the last thing I want to do, and I'll finish with that, don't let a good crisis go to waste. Do not lose the opportunity. Prepare today for either the next phase of the epidemic or prepare for the next crisis. Project yourself and your company in time. What in 2 months? What in 6 months? And one of my little habits, and I've been in this field for quite some time, is I have a separate notebook, which I use. Separate notebook. Not what I don't write in that my daily work or whatever I have to remember, or the conference calls or this and that. This is the little book for later, for analyzing the odd thing. I write in there, interesting for later. Can't do it now, but this will come in handy. And I have to remember, because don't forget one last point about anxiety and fear, is that it makes you forgetful. So you forget short-term memories. Write them down, use them to prepare the next. And as far as this is, I think I will close here and pass the floor to Pedro.
Thank you, Axel. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
We already got a good number of questions for you, so briefly I'm going now to go through what's the economic impact of this crisis. We have to remember what Axel just told us. This might be totally uncorrelated to the death rate. It's just what are the policies that we have been implementing to try to stop this crisis, what is the economic impact that is having. So I will start when we get the presentation on the... No.
This is mine, yes. Those are my extra slides.
Yes, extra slides.
So
we need the other...
They may come handy for the question and answer, but...
So we need the... Oh, it's here. So while we set up, let me remind you that before this crisis, we were living time of high uncertainty. People, by the end of last year, were thinking, is the world economy or United States going to a next type of recession? So I will start showing some number of the projection that we had for the growth of the GDP before the crisis, and you can see that already we have not a very positive look at the situation. No? So here we have the growth of GDP. That's okay. That's so here we have the growth of GDP of the world, and here we have the 2009 crisis. So this one, and then we recover, and the IMF, January this year, presented rate of growth for this year and the next one that are below the 3.5% that have been the average during the last 30 years. So we were not in a very good shape. Instead of okay, there we are. There it is. Okay, we are not in a very good shape. These were the uncertainty from the IMF data, and you can see 2009 2.9% world output, 3.3 this year, below the rate of growth, although recovering. And advanced economies, we see a growth that is pretty slow for the standards. United States will go 2.0%, and the euro area much lower growth. Emerging markets were doing well, and here the point that we want to emphasize is it's the case of China. China with a lower growth, but still growing this year at 6.0%. But this was before the coronavirus. This was before the big pandemic that we have. When you see at the manufacturing PMI, you can see here that Eurozone was below 50. Below 50 implied contraction in manufacturing. Japan also below 50. That's also in bad shape. But China was in 50 and United States above 50. So China was doing okay, although was not in a booming year. The Eurozone, this is mostly the case of Germany. That is 33% of the Eurozone. The manufacturing sector was declining because of the car industry, the doubt about the utilization of diesel or not diesel, the doubt about what was going on in demand from the rest of the world. United States was growing at a decent rate, even more. If you look at the expansion in the American economy, since we have data around mid-1800, we have never seen that long expansion in the cycle of United States. We have been growing without recession in United States since June 2009. We have more than 10 years, more than 120 months of continuous growth in United States. And beside that, all the fears that were appearing at the end of 2019 about potential recession, they were receding. Today, the rate of unemployment in the United States, it's below 4%, the lowest in 60 years. There are more job offerings than people looking for jobs in the United States these days. Very good situation. Europe, lower growth. Germany toyed with the idea of going into recession, but bounced up in the last quarter. Italy, in tough situation, zero growth, but the Eurozone growing at last quarter at 1%. So that was the situation. And again, no fear of recession. That's how we were. Although high uncertainty, not booming. China, as I told you before, 50 PMI. The economy, we are going in path to 6% growth. But then we start the worries on this world, no? And we face a lot of worries looking forward. The first one was the trade war, how this will end. This trade war already was implying a substantial shock in the supply chain of this world. It was a supply shock that was trying to start to disappear, but we were not sure how that is going to happen. January 15, the Chinese authority decided to sign an agreement that they will start buying more goods from the United States, but the United States still have high barriers to China's products. So this is creating a process of deglobalization that eliminating the efficiency of the world economy, and we were hoping that will finish soon, but it's not clear that will happen. First, worry. Second, negative debt pile. Since we came out from the Great Recession, the central banks, the most important central banks, has increased the quantity of money by 6 to 7 times. So today we have in the Eurozone negative interest rate since 2015. If I want to buy a German bond at 30 years, I have to pay the German government because the yield of those bonds are negative, and the yields of other countries' bonds are also negative because this huge tsunami of liquidity. And in the United States, we have still today a stock market that is very, very much overvalued because of this incredible increase in the supply of money. Last year, 25% of the bonds sold, corporate bond sold in the world, 25%, excuse me, in developed countries, not in the world, in developed countries, 25%, they have negative yields. And 50% of the bonds sold in developed countries have real interest rate, negative real interest rate, below 1%. So this is a huge amount of money. What's happened with the central bank? They continue pumping money into the economy, they will say, because of this uncertainty. So this creates a lot of problems, mostly to the financial sector. If the interest rates are zero or negative, banks cannot make money. So today, the European banks, the capitalization of the European banks is below the book value of the European banks because of this huge impact negative. That's another doubt that we had, no? The third one is Brexit. Although Brexit was finally agreed, starting this month, start the conversation. In June, we will know how the conversations are going, and by October, November, we will see how will be the agreement of this divorce, no? If by June there is no clear agreement, the divorce and the parts are fighting, the idea that we will extend the process. Boris Johnson say, by no means we are going to extend the process. By December, we are going to leave. So that can be also a negative shock that was creating big problems. And finally, Japan is going into recession. October last year, they increased the tax on consumption. Last quarter of last year, in yearly terms, the GDP of Japan went down 6.3%. That before coronavirus, before 6.3, by an increase in consumption tax in October of last year. In the middle of this uncertainty, we have China and the coronavirus. And this is put more uncertainty in this world that is. So how can we assess this? How will be a way to do this? We don't have too many. We don't know how this virus epidemic will go through different countries. We don't know how long it will be end by summer or not, etc., etc. There are a lot of questions, so we have uncertainty. So people have reacted to this by looking how was the SARS. Say, let's take another situation similar, and they went to see what the SARS. So you see here a decline, 9.1 in the 2% decline in the growth of the GDP of China. Retails went down, export went down, imports went down. So this, it's although was not a substantial shock, it was a pretty important one. A decline of 2% in the rate of growth yearly, it is a substantial one. But this is not a very good idea to do this. Why? Because you see, in 2003, 2002, the year before of the crisis, China was only 6% of the world economy. Today is almost 18% of the world economy. Who is the main trade partner of Australia today? China. Who is the main trade partner of Brazil? China. Who is the main trade partner of all South American countries? China. Who is the main trade partner of 35 African countries? China. So China is a very important economy today, with a GDP of almost, in PPP, in purchasing power, almost $20 trillion US. So it's a global trade. In 2002 was only 4%, today it's more than 10%. Global FDI, also a substantial increase. And in the global tourists, that is it's increase, a humongous increase that now is affecting that sector heavily, because that is. And here you see the contribution to real GDP of China. This is in gold here, is the contribution of China. China, to the rate of growth of the world, China today, it's 40%. So this is a very important country for, Other variables that make China important, the demand for commodities. Today, China demands 50%, more than 50% of aluminum, 50% of the copper, 50. So if the economy goes down, all the countries that are commodity export will have a huge shock because that demand will go down. In fact, the commodity cycle ended 6 years ago because China have a little slowdown in the buying of commodities. This will be even higher impact. Sub-Saharan countries, South American countries will heavily feel this thing, no? And we saw also how China now it's important in the value chain. So here you have for computers, electronics, China is 27% of all the structure of the value chain for that. Or China is 15% in transfer equipment sector. So China is important part of this process of globalization and dividing the value chain in different places. Finally, China has an impact in other Asian countries. 25% of the GDP of Taiwan are export to China. And also you see here the Chinese tourism. And here I have another one about tourism, the importance of the tourism of China and Hong Kong. So this China is totally different today. OECD has taken all these variables and has estimated how important is this shock, the Chinese shock. And what they come out that the world economy that grew 2.9 this year will grow to 2.4%. That is substantial change from the initial estimates that were close to 3%. And this will have an impact in all these countries. This one here, the arrow are indicated the impact of, so you see a substantial impact in the world economy and a substantial impact also in emerging markets because of the connection that China has across the world. So we see, here we see the decline in growth of the world, 2.4 was supposed to be 2.9, almost 3. The impact over G20, the impact of United States, much higher impact over the euro area than over United States. China, the euro area is more exposed to China than United States, and substantial impact in the rest of the world. So, but OECD say, but we don't see any sort of recession out of this. We have a negative impact, substantial, if this pandemic is contained. If the government do the right thing, and we don't have something more than 6 months on this. But of course, if you look at this, it sounds like it's extremely optimistic. Because look at the PMI of China. I showed you this before. This is the data for January this year. 50, January this year. This is the data for February this year. 38.8. Substantial decline in this one. So we saw in Japan a tax on consumption, 6% decline at the yearly basis. So maybe this thing will create something like that for the Chinese economy. And we can make some simple exercises, no? Let's assume that this recession, that this virus has a V shape. So it's a shock that will last this quarter. By next quarter, we won't have any shock of this. So it's a substantial shock this quarter at this PMI. How substantial? Let's assume that the first quarter of this year, the decline in the GDP of China is 2%. Not 6% that happened in Japan. Yes, a decline of 2%. And let's assume that the rest of the year, China growth as normal, that was projected 6% in a yearly basis. So this is so 1.5, that will imply in 4 quarter growth 6%. Very simple exercise, no? What will imply for the world economy? For the Chinese economy, that will imply that China will grow 2.2% and the world economy is 1.9%. This assuming only the impact on China. I'm not taking into account any impact or any other countries, and I'm assuming a V shape that has a 2% impact only. That will be the impact for the world economy. Or if you want to be a little more negative or realistic, I don't know how you want to call it, let's assume 2% the first quarter, 0 the next one because in the process that we are in, and 1.5. If that is the case, China will grow at 1% instead of 6%. And the world at 1.3%. Again, this assuming no impact in any other country. This assuming a V-shape with some delay type of recovery. So is a global recession possible? Yes, of course it's possible, because the measure that we have taken for this. Again, this is totally uncorrelated to the death burden of this virus. It's just because of the policies that have been taken to undermine the effect of this virus, you know. And this is what is. It's very difficult. Governments take policies according to the perceived risk, not to the actual risk, and that's what they need to do. That's why it's a. So this is a, but this will have a substantial economic impact. So if this is the situation, if you add the rest of the countries that are affected, Italy, South Korea, and the rest, it's highly probable that we will see. It's not crazy to think that we might have a recession into the system, or a recession coming for the world economy. So two things come out of this. The first one is that we have to be very careful about the policies that are undertaken. We are in looking at the supply shock. The reaction of the government until now, the Fed, for example, has been pumping more money to the system. If I have a supply shock, if I have a problem with the value chain, you can dump all the money of the world. That won't have any effect. That will calm the market. Maybe that we won't see a more substantial impact in the stock market, whatever. But the real problem is not being fixed. That's the first thing. Secondly, whatever is the behavior of the virus, did we have a long-term effect? One thing that this virus has done is to make it clear that to have a dependency on China, an exposure on China in the value chain is extremely risky. So whatever happens, we will see in the future spread of this value change. And that might imply a decline in the rate of growth of the world, because we will lose efficiency. The trade war plus the coronavirus might be the elements that will trigger a process of deglobalization in the world, of deglobalization. And this has not been the trend since 1970s. Since the 1970s that we have seen a trend toward globalization and toward a better use of the resources around the world. If we are going to a deglobalization, a balkanization, however you want to call it, the long-term rate of growth of the world will tend to decrease. And this is something that we have to be careful. Okay, so I will go immediately to the question to Axel, that we have many questions here for you, and that the first one is, do you think that the market are answering to this crisis in the right way, or are they in a rational way?
Well, analyzing market response, I think, Pedro, this is more your field than mine. Yes. So analyzing it, I've mentioned it before in my part of the talk. There is an element of irrationality, which is easily explained by the size of the uncertainty. The uncertainty is so large that it is difficult to find, the right approach, and so there is a decorrelation there. I did mention very briefly in the people, rushing to the supermarkets to buy pasta, and the traders, selling because they don't want to be the last one left standing. You have rational behavior on an individual basis, which leads to an irrational result. So that's about what I mean. And for the economics, that is your field.
We're going to take advantage that you are here. The other one is somebody say, I live in Milan and work for a digital media. Somebody asking this question, no? And people tell that we have a bad behavior, but it's very difficult to know what is actually happening. We are telling the world what are the information. What is your advice to improve the quality of information that people receive?
I was myself quite surprised to hear from friends who were calling me and said, we don't have information. I said, really? There is so much information out there, but maybe there is so much that it takes. It is useful to actually just step back and take and relax a little bit in terms of what information you're looking for, where you find this information, and what you can do with it. Clearly, the situation is not the same if you're living in Milan under quarantine, or if you are in a country where nothing very visible is happening. Now, many countries at least have put dedicated hotlines that you can actually call to get advice. They do. I mean, in many cases, there are a number of websites, starting from the World Health Organization, for the public health agency of the country where you're living in, the European Center for Disease Control, and you can actually find. So it depends, of course, what information you want.
Yes. We have to, unfortunately, we have to cut it here because we have a panel coming in. What we are going to do, we are going to try to answer some of these online later on, some of these questions. So because we have to give time to the next panel. Thank you very much for your attention.
Meng, if you can join me. And Iago. Professor Zhu, where are you? So good afternoon. My name is Mike Rosenberg. I'm a strategy professor at IESE and we're going to have a panel discussion. We brought professors up here, two from our managing people in organization unit. I'm from the strategy group, and Wang Zhu will join me in a moment from operations management.
Q&A, right?
Start, and then we'll pass it on to some of my colleagues. And what we're trying to do with this panel is, given the situation that has been described, I think, amazingly well by both Pedro and by Axel, is what should companies do? What should people actually do as they look at this? Because, okay, this is a situation, it's a scary situation, or maybe it's not so bad, it's up to you, but what should people do? So the model I use when I'm looking at this kind of stuff is by Patrick Lagadec. Patrick Lagadec is a French professor. He's probably the world authority on crisis management. And Monsieur Lagadec, or Professor Lagadec, has his model of crisis management has 5 pieces to it. The first is anticipating the crisis. The second is detecting the crisis, reacting to the crisis, inventing solutions, and finally mobilizing. Alberto, if you want to join us up here, and if somebody could find Diego de la Silva, he's supposed to be in the middle, yeah? And if we look at that model, and I think it's probably the most robust model, if you will, it's important. I think it could be very helpful to do. So anticipating the crisis, you might say it's too late to anticipate. But when I went to give Axel a hug today, I said, Axel, how are you? He says, hey. Now, maybe it's not necessary to stop shaking hands and stuff today, but it might be necessary tomorrow. So if we think about anticipating, both at the corporate level and even in our daily life, there are things we can do. What Lagadec says in anticipating is, probably most of you in the audience and most of you online have already been, or your company has already formed, a crisis management committee. Now, a crisis management committee is a whole topic. Ideally, you want men and women on the crisis management committee who represent the different functions of the business, but also are people who are creative, people who can see systemic issues, people who can make decisions based on incomplete information and weak signals, because very often the data we have is not ready yet, and can kind of think about crazy ideas which might come out of the box and even break the rules. Now, typically, the solution for the Crisis Management Committee is to take the bosses of the different units and put them in the committee. But I don't know about the bosses in your units, but most bosses are not the people I just described. People who can react quickly, think out of the box, and respond to imperfect information. They're very careful, they're very political, and they're very different than perhaps the ideal people. So in terms of anticipation, if you had the time to get those people together before, rather than when the crisis hits, might have been a good idea. But it's probably too late for many of us because this crisis is already upon us. And in terms of the crisis, in my view, I'll let Axel be the public health official, but it's probably more an economic crisis than anything else. We actually ran a webinar last week while I was in New York, and we polled the people in the webinar, have you seen some economic impact? 61% of the people who responded said it's been moderate or severe. Another 30-some-odd% said we have weak signals. And only 4% said there's no problem yet. Now, of course, it depends what business you're in. If you're the airline business, if you're in different businesses, it's different. Detecting is about getting the data. Getting the data in your business, getting the data from the World Health Organization, et cetera, but actually knowing what's going on. In supply chain, we had a person on the webinar who said they've done a lot of data analysis to understand who their suppliers are, who the suppliers of their suppliers are, and who the suppliers of their suppliers are, to really understand how exposed they are to supply chain risk. This is what the Lagedec would call detection, to really know where we are. Reacting is what to do. And reacting is complicated because with imperfect information and a degree of fear, there are different reactions. One is anxiety. Anxiety, I'll let my colleague define that later, but it's basically not knowing what to do, even though you know you have to do something. Overreacting is another possibility. Doing too much, taking too much of a steps, and then you could take a more denial, just say it's not a problem, which is another psychological phenomena. So reacting has to be measured to some degree. Inventing has to do with figuring out the way that the organization can keep with its fundamental mission. Why are you in business anyway? Satisfy your customers and provide the goods and services that you're there to provide. Keep the lights on and keep the cash flow coming. Is there a way to do that which perhaps is different than you've done before, which will keep people safe? This is really the challenge of inventing and why you need a crisis management team which can kind of sometimes come up with new ideas, and mobilizing is to get everybody behind it. Now, I'll let Iago talk about communications in a minute, but the idea is that communication has to happen through this entire phase, and you might go back and do this in several loops. So communication is about discussing what's going on, but you want to communicate that you're studying the situation when you're studying it, and providing actual guidance of what to do when you actually know what to do. And for me, and I'll let my colleagues talk a minute, the key idea is safety first. Because all of us need to keep our people safe, keep our customers safe, or our students safe. And this is clearly part of our responsibility as business leaders. But if the way to keep people safe is to send everybody home, then we're going to create perhaps an economic problem which is bigger and more devastating and will cause more hardship in the world than this virus will cause by itself. This is an image that the New York Times a couple of days ago published videos of the virus from space, showing different parts of the world, and how many people were there. And this is Tiananmen Square from a couple of days ago compared to a normal, and there's no people in the square. So, what does keeping people safe mean? Does it mean providing hand sanitizer? Does it mean having a hotline to call, as Axel says? Does it mean making it easy for people to stay home if they're sick? In many parts of the world, a lot of frontline people don't get paid if they don't come to work. So do we want them to come to work anyway? Or do we tell them, hey, it's okay, call the number, talk to the doctor, and if they allow you to stay home, you stay home and you get full pay? Some people might stay home anyway. Well, which is the worst problem? Having some people watching television who could have come to work, or keeping your people safe? While I was in New York, I had the pleasure to go to a basketball game. The New York Knicks, they lost to the Utah Jazz, but this was last Wednesday night at Madison Square Garden. The New York City is still open for business. People are going to basketball games. And part of the challenge is how to go through this inventing phase, this reaction phase, and find the right way to keep your people safe, to comply with the mission of your business and why you're there anyway, to not induce more fear and panic, which is not good for society. And if you understand that business is part of society, I don't think that's a good plan. And actually keep the cash flow coming in so you can keep the lights on and keep yourself in business. To me, these are the strategy challenges that this crisis brings us, which is how can we reinvent aspects of our business to make it through the crisis and come out in September perhaps stronger than we were before. I'll come back with some final comments, but first let me introduce my colleague, Zhu Wengming. Zhu is a professor in operations management. He's done his PhD at the University of Maryland. He did his physics degree in Hong Kong, and I understand your parents live in Beijing.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, what exactly is this about Chinese New Year, and why is it such a big deal? And I think you've got some more slides.
All right. So first, you can take a look at the timeline here, right? So in the upper part, we have like in the parallel universe, had the coronavirus didn't hit us, what's going to happen, right? So usually, like a week ahead of this Chinese New Year, people will still like work in the factory, but you see, we have limited operations. A lot of people they started going home, right? And then usually, what happens is the last shipment is out right before the Chinese New Year. But then you see it's shortly after 10 days, people will resume back to the factory and they come back to work. And like in another 1 or 2 weeks, all the factories, they're going to be fully functional, right? And there are going to be orders out, stuff like that. But if you look at this year, right, the last shipment is still out, left China at January 24th. But then what happens is that we had this like severe coronavirus hitting China. And then if you take a look, yes, around February 20th, 28th, we have the shipment basically arriving United States, arriving Europe, right? And now, like a week ago, we barely kind of resumed back to work. And I'll explain in a minute. It's only like a partial kind of a recovery, partial recovery. I'm going to talk about why it's only partial, all right?
Wengming, a colleague told me that in his company, the Chinese plants opened about 2 weeks late, and today they're about 50% capacity. 50% capacity.
That's right, because Mike, tell you what, a lot of the employees, if, for example, you happen to be from Wuhan, it's impossible for you to leave the city, right? Even if you want to go back to work, you're healthy, and the government give the company the green light. It's very hard for you to actually arrive.
This person might have gone to Wuhan to visit his mother for Chinese New Year, and he can't get back to wherever the
Exactly. So if you happen to be in a city that is in lockdown, then there's no way for you to get out, right? Now, if you take a look at this, usually those companies in EU, in United States, they anticipate that there are going to be an order at around like 2 weeks after Chinese New Year, and there are going to be more orders coming in like in the next 2 weeks, in the next 4 weeks, et cetera, right? So how much safety stock do you think they have? They don't have much. And nowadays the trend is, let's go lean, go just in time. I don't have a lot of stock in my warehouse. But now what's going on is that they really need to plan on this, on the recovery, and do the scenario planning. How many more days I can run my business without going into this supply kind of a shortage, right? And the problem is, if you do this scenario planning, you have to really need to consider worst case. And why is that? If you take a look at this, basically, again, this is data from NASA. You can see this is the nitrogen dioxide, NO2 emission from China. And pretty much, if you compare pre-Chinese New Year to after Chinese New Year, you can see that basically and we use the NO2 emission as an analogy to how vibrant the business activity is, right? And if you take a look at it, basically this stopped. It's an entire shutdown of the supply chain.
But it's also better for air pollution.
That's good. That's a silver lining here. But for example, if you zoom in and look at Wuhan, pretty much there's nothing. And if you look at the scale, the entire supply chain is pretty much paralyzed by this coronavirus. And now if you're asking, hey, I know that my orders will be delayed, but by how long? Look at this, it's really bad. I would say pretty long. And why is that? For example, if you have a supply chain, right, and if you're one of the companies within the supply chain, you say, hey, you know what? I somehow come up with this brilliant strategy so that workers can come back and work without getting reinfected. But you know what? The fact that you unilaterally decide to resume back to work is nearly impossible. Why? For example, the public transportation is not recovered. Restaurants, they're not opening. And your supplier, the company's own supplier, they are not working. And your customers, they're not working either, right? So you see, if a single node in the supply chain decides to go back to work, in this circumstance, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. You have to reach a status where, like, the government says, oh, I think now it's safe. Everybody goes back to work, and then...
I mean, that's what the Chinese government is trying to do, I guess.
It's trying to do. So what happens right now is that for Wuhan and for the surrounding areas, you still cannot work. You still have this very draconian quarantine going on. But outside of Wuhan, the government is trying to encourage people to go back to work. And that kind of brings me to the next point, which is why do you think government is trying to do that? And if you look at the short-term kind of solutions or challenges, the third bullet point, we talk about like the exposure, et cetera, but third bullet point is secure enough liquidity. And now the problem is not like how long...
Make enough money to keep the lights on.
Exactly. For a lot of small suppliers or small companies in general, it's very hard for them because during this time period, I don't have demand, but I still need to pay rent. I still need to pay taxes, right? And how about the loan that I previously borrowed? I need to repay them as well, but I have no cash flow whatsoever. So for them, it's really, really extremely difficult. That's why I think the Chinese government is putting the bank onto the front line as well, saying you have to borrow cheap loans to those small and medium-sized companies. Otherwise, after 2 months, the crisis is over, but so are the SMEs.
I mean, these ideas for short-term solutions could also apply to Western businesses, to anybody, basically.
For sure. I think what happened in China is like, you have 20 days, 30 days window to look at what happened in China and then come up with solutions. You can take a look at, scrutinize all the problems, the inefficiencies that happened in China, and think of, hey, now that I got 30 days window, of course it's shrinking, but what can I do to solve all those problems, right? And I think for the secure liquidity, to get cash, to get loans, it's not only the company's responsibility, but also that of government, and also the bigger party in the supply chain. You need to extend credit to those small companies, and government needs to make sure that the bank is playing its role properly. Right?
And could you quickly touch on the bullwhip effect for those people who maybe it's a long time since you did your MBA or your program here at IESE?
Exactly.
Could you just touch on that quickly and then get to the kind of long-term stuff?
Right. So this stabilize the supply chain is very interesting. Now you see a lot of people going to Walmart, going to Costco. They buy all kinds of stuff, toilet paper, masks, right? And the fact that you have this kind of hoarding or rent behavior is really bad for the supply chain. As what happens is that for the customers, for retailers, I'm trying to get my stuff, right? But apparently where a lot of things are in shortage. So what happens is that knowing you place your order, you will only be getting a fraction out of your order. What happens is that people double the size of their order or triple the quantity that they order, right? And those signals are really confusing to the suppliers. If you see suddenly an influx of huge amount of order, then what should you do? You fulfill all of them, part of them, right? And even if you go back 100% into production, seeing this, you're drowning into orders, and what do? Nowadays, BYD, the electric car manufacturing, and also Foxconn, they bought a production line for producing masks just because there are so many people ordering it, right? So pretty much, it's one thing to go back to production. The other thing is that after that, how do you prioritize your orders? And what quantity you produce, right?
And last thing, in terms of long term, what should companies be thinking about?
Yeah.
Long term, I guess, is 6 months or a year.
6 months or a year, right? Exactly. Then, so I think, well, there are some cliches like you need to know your suppliers, and you can achieve that by kind of digitize your supply chain. You use visual tools, you use ERP, Internet of Things, and then you automate your supply chain to mitigate the risk, right? But also, I think it's a high time for the companies to stop and reflect on how they have been doing business. Because what happens is that people are usually short-sighted. They are focusing on how do I fulfill the KPI for this quarter, but they rarely thought about, hey, what other aspects should I put emphasis on, right? So usually people say productivity, that's number one. That's what we taught students in the classroom. You need to boost the productivity. But now the thing is how to build a more resilient supply chain. Can you do dual sourcing, multiple sourcing? Can you invest in the weakest link in the supply chain so that even the weakest link become pretty robust? Right? Stuff like that. Those are very important.
I understand that Schneider Electric has 2 sources of supply for everything they buy.
Exactly.
One in Asia and one somewhere else, just in case these kinds of things happen.
Yes. In short term, those may not be the most efficient thing to do. Right? But in the long term, you can definitely benefit from that. I mean, of course, nobody knows where and when will the next disruption happen. But the thing is that if you have suppliers based at different locations, at least that's going to buy you some time to react.
And last question, Zhu Weiming, are you worried about your parents in Beijing?
Well, they're fine. You know, they stay at their apartment. And now the thing is that if you go in and out, you need to show some like a passport, and then in a lot of cities you can only go in and out limited amount of times every day to limit the physical human-to-human interaction. But
well, thank you so much. Our next speaker is Iago de la Cerva. Iago is a PhD from the University of Navarra. He's a communications specialist. He's been a television journalist. He's been a communications director of large companies and large institutions. And he's a professor of communication. Iago, what are the communications aspects of this whole story?
Well, what happens with communications is that we don't solve problems. But without us, problems are not solved. So I think communications are an important part of this chaotic situation. And so let me start with 3 communications principles that can help us in order to... Let me push this. Okay, the first one is, of course, we have heard the Axel explaining how important are indicators, where to look in order to have the most important information we need to use. But at the same time, communicators will tell you facts, numbers, hard evidence is really important for us, but we have to put a lot of importance into perceptions. I know maybe the media are getting crazy about this, but perceptions, what your stakeholders, what your employees are thinking, this is as important as the facts, as the number of deaths or contaminated people, etc.
Axel mentioned this Corona TV show, which is going on all the time.
Yeah, but the problem is, if your stakeholders, if your employees are watching that TV, don't blame it on the media, just take this into account and consider this as a fact. It's as hard as a fact. So the second principle would be, watch out that our stakeholders, our employees, which is the main stakeholder, the employees understand that the company's goal, the ultimate goal for a company is not to reduce these perceptions, but to reduce risks. Because otherwise, they will not trust us. So our communication efforts is just to reduce, to make sure that our stakeholders understand that we are not trying to lie to them. We are not trying to reduce the perception, but to reduce the factor. So in this way, we will be able to communicate with them, and we will be able to reduce.
Because if they're afraid, and we tell them don't be afraid, there's nothing to be afraid about, they'll just think we're lying.
They think they will lie, that we are lying, but the worst thing would be that the most intelligent people listening to us will panic. So the more sophisticated our audience is, they will trust us less. Okay, we are in a business school, so we are used to talk to very intelligent people, very competent, whatever. So these people are really hard to handle. Okay, and the second principle I would like to point out is our stakeholders, our main stakeholder, our priority should be with our employees. Of course, we have to be consistent, but our employees will be those who will be the source of information to every other stakeholder. So, our priorities, our personnel. And then, suggestions, what to do, what not to do. I'm invading a little bit Albert's field, because we'll be talking about risks. So the first one is, be ready not to deal with everybody in the same situation. So risks, the risk perception depends on age, depends on education, depends on responsibilities. Not everybody will feel the same with this. So we have to take care of this and be able to distinguish between people and adapt to them. And the only way to adapt to them is with empathy. Empathy is what will tell us not to react hardly when we see crazy reactions, outbursts of fear in our companies, in our teams. Empathy will make us listen carefully, and listen to our stakeholders is very important, because if we don't listen to them, they would not listen to us. So empathy is the key element to reduce tension. So that's my first recommendation. The second recommendation is to understand that risk is united, as Axel was saying, to familiarity. So we are afraid of the unknown, and to control. We are afraid of something we don't control, which means that in communication, what we have to do is to transmit the idea that they control what they do, what they don't do. So it's given them, is our communication efforts or initiatives regard how to give them the information for them to take decisions. If they don't take decisions, it's like change, promoting change. People do not resist change. People resist to be changed. So we have to give them the tools for them to take the decision when to move, where to stay, etc. My third recommendation would be, concerns are not about the past, how many people died, how many people were contagious, etc. But it's about the future. So what people have in mind right now is what's going to happen. What companies should do is not just to tell them what they have done, is what are the decisions they have already anticipated for them. So, because at the end, the question they have in their minds is, can we trust our leaders? And this is the usual question. And they will trust us if we share with them our plans, our scenarios. If we share our scenarios, they will calm down, they will understand they can trust us. If we don't trust them being transparent with our scenarios, they will not trust us. And if our employees don't trust us, we don't know what they are going to do. And this is the worst case scenario. My fourth recommendation would be, risks create confusion and uncertainty, which means that communication is much more difficult. So what we have to do is to make sure that communication is so clear that people who are really distracted will understand the message. Use images, short sentences, many examples. It's not speaking to dumb people, okay? But we have to do that, okay? Because otherwise, it's confusing. And
This reminds me of the American election when they said, keep it simple, stupid, right?
exactly, it's the KISS principle. This is the right moment to apply the KISS principle. And in order and communications is important to use bidirectional channels. So we need to listen. So the idea of someone telling everybody to everybody, everything to everybody doesn't work. We have to create networks. We have to create like hotlines in which people can talk and we can listen to them. My fifth recommendation would be silence doesn't work in crisis. So even we think we have told everything we know, we have to keep insisting, because this is like controlling our cell phone. How is it possible I'm not getting any message? So our question would be, my cell phone is not working.
Yeah, Iago,
No.
the World Health Organization is publishing a bulletin every day. Would
Yeah.
you recommend that in a company people publish a bulletin every day?
Depends on the companies, depend on the countries, but yes, once a day is a very good frequency.
But once a month is probably not enough.
No, because people will look for the information they need somewhere else. So we cannot provide information with this. So silence is so keep informing people. That's something. And the last one is, let's not be overconfident. When someone is overconfident, when the overconfidence only creates more panic, either because people realized that we think of ourselves like very, very prepared people, and so intelligent people panic again. And also because when we are overconfident, we don't prepare ourselves. And when we don't prepare ourselves, we receive very difficult questions. We are not prepared. And we improvise. And
You
sometimes
you
we
should
lie.
talk to this guy called Donald Trump in the United States, because I think he doesn't have this message. But anyway, I promise not to be very political
I have
tonight.
no idea who Donald Trump is. Okay?
Anyway, Alberto
But-
Rivera, thank you very much, Iago. Alberto
welcome.
Rivera is a medical doctor with a PhD in economics. He has had leading responsibilities in international healthcare and mental health care. So you have one slide here. We have one. If you can push the button. You have one slide. I made you a slide. So this kind of image creates a certain degree of anxiety. How can people, handle the stress?
Well, first, so it's clear that stress is one of the clear impacts of what's going on. Right? Before coming here, I checked the latest figures by the WHO. I think there are around 100,000 people infected all over the world. 80,000 in China, 20,000 in the rest of the world, almost 1,000 or around 1,000 in Spain. This is 100,000 people, but I think that there are millions of people that you can say emotionally infected already in the world. Millions probably. So is this healthy? Is this unhealthy? To some extent, it might be healthy. So stress. I think it's normal to feel stressed in front of the unknown, in front of uncertainty. Thanks to that stress, we've been taking measures that are healthy, like introducing hygienic measures. Like now we wash our hands more properly and more accurately. We avoid touching eyes, nose and mouth. We are restricting travel that maybe were necessary. Maybe out of that also it will learn that maybe travel can be reduced. So there are some responses that come out of this fear that are healthy. But if this stress is too much, then it's when it becomes this, let's say, very unhealthy situation of distress. No? Before coming, just before coming to this, when we were moving from second floor to fourth floor, someone I met told me that he has stopped going to gym because of fear of what may happen in these situations in which there is a crowd. I'm not sure that this is a very healthy response about what's going on. No? So too much stress, how can is counterproductive? It's counterproductive even from a pure physiological perspective. I mean, overstress, too much stress is reducing our capacity of immunity. So even our defenses in front of a virus get reduced. Under stress, our energy, emotional, physical, mental, gets drained. Axel has already mentioned how under stress our capacity for decision making, because our clarity of mind gets impacted. Axel has said, the cost of a crisis derives more from fear and from anxiety than from the real threat that we have in front. No? So in that situation, what can be recommended? I think that, to me, the first point will be, so let's not overestimate the danger that we are facing. After listening to Pedro Videla, I thought that maybe actually I need to be afraid of maybe losing my job because of the economic recession that may arrive. But for sure, I think that this is a major danger than getting infected by a virus, at least in this part of the world. Do not anticipate the worst scenario. You've spoken of scenario planning, but okay, we may just remember what happened with SARS in 2003, with the arrival of spring and warm weather.
Yeah, I'm told by Axel in talking earlier that it's not so much that the temperature kills the virus, but when people go outside, they have more time outside, they open the windows, they walk outside in nature. And all of that makes, it's different than when everybody's inside kind of huddled together in the cold.
But the fact that was the arrival of spring, and it faded. Or, if we are going to anticipate scenarios, also we can anticipate the scenario in which the vaccine will be developed, so we'll have more resources to face the challenge and the threatening situation that we are facing. So first point, do not overestimate the danger. Second, do not underestimate the resources that we have to cope with the problem. One, for instance, that the health systems will take more measures, and for instance, the vaccine will be developed. No? WHO has published I think that was a few weeks ago, in one of the reports about the coronavirus, used a word that was infodemics. Axel has spoken at length about that. You've mentioned as well. The problem of we, in front of uncertainty, our tendency will be to get more information, but to the point of getting really obsessed of getting more information. If we get trapped into that obsession, the more information we try to get, the more we panic, and the more we get in this loop that then is very difficult to break. No? As I think Axel has already said, I think that a very important recommendation will be limit your source of information to one or two reliable sources, maybe WHO, or in each country the Ministry of Health, or the relevant source of information, and don't be searching for other sources that might be not so accurate. This compulsive search for information, that I think that Lancet, the medical journal, published, I think, in an article that was published, I think, last week, said there was one line that said, altruism is better than compulsion. So, and it was reporting some experiences when the SARS crisis or the Fukushima crisis, companies that get more resilient were companies in which also they put in place even some sort of actions of solidarity, so helping people to think more, can I do anything for the crisis that is and I think the example also here at IESE, how our MBA Chinese Business Club reacted, trying to put in place some initiative to help people there, or the IESE alumni chapter in China. That helps to overcome that vicious circle of getting trapped into being self-conscious about the danger of what may arrive.
Thank you, Alberto. I'm going to have one more comment on resilience, but if you do have questions, we have ladies to pick up the questions and bring them to me. We also, if you have questions on LinkedIn or questions on the WebEx platform, please type them in and they will bring those questions to me. So the last kind of point that we have, and then I'm going to go to a question for Weng Ming, is resilience. We've talked about resilience. I get my inspiration from ecology. These 7 ideas are from the Stockholm Resilience Center, which looks at nature. This house is an interesting house. It says it was called the Sand Palace in Mexico Beach in Florida. If you remember, in October last year, was a terrible hurricane, knocked down the entire town except for this house. And the folks who built it, the family which built it, said, we built a house which would withstand any storm anyone could imagine. They spent about 30% more money on the house than they had to, but the house was the only one standing in the neighborhood, except for another one behind it. The disaster people had to use their house to help with the disaster efforts because there's no place else to go. So it's about diversity, it's about redundancy, and the last one is interesting. The last one is to promote what they call different governance systems, which are interlocking. So people on the ground in different places who can make their own decisions, but then are connected by common values. And as I said earlier, in my view, this is a chance for leaders, a chance for companies to really show their integrity, to show what they're made of, and to show if the mission statement and the value statement is real or if it's just something written on the wall. Anyway, let me go to questions. There's a question for you, Zhu Weming, which is from a supply chain perspective, will we ever get the money back which we lost? A month or two is gone. Is there any way to get that money back?
All right. Well, the thing is that the money you lose in a disruption, well, you can only make it back afterwards, right? By improving your resilience of your supply chain, by increasing the productivity. But I think you're asking, hey, can I recover fully the money I lost? That's a question mark. I think for a lot of supply chain, there are going to be multiple numbers, multiple nodes, multiple companies just go bankrupt after this. And it's going to take quite a while for the supply chain to recover.
Okay, so here's a question which I'd like to ask to all our panelists. It's, can you name one practical step a CEO could take right now, today, to reduce harm to their company? Alberto, do you want to start? And we'll go all the way down the line, and I have an idea.
Well, make clear the procedures and be transparent on the human resources policies that you establish in the company.
Iago, one thing that someone can do right now.
I think it would be very good to have a climate poll on what's the situation with my stakeholders, with my employees, to understand how are they concerned about this, and listening to their not just the concerns but proposals, etc.
What do you mean?
All right. So if you have alternative supplier, call them. If you don't have them, start developing relationships for the next time.
And for me, I would say, as Axel said earlier, never let a good crisis go without taking advantage of it. This will not be the last pandemic, and it will not be the last disruption. We might have disruptions, political disruptions, geopolitical disruptions, environmental disruptions. So I think the idea of making sure you use this, because while the virus is dangerous, it's not that dangerous a virus. The economic impact will be severe, but most of us will be fine. If you take your vitamins and you don't have my mom's 85 with a lung condition, she's in danger, but not everybody is. So I think take advantage of this one really to prepare the next one. Here's a related question I don't know if any of you want to take a pick at it, then if not, I'll try, which is this is the unforeseen hitting the real economy. Is this the end of globalization, or is this just something we have to think about?
I think you have to.
That one's for you, I guess, and I'll add to it.
So Pedro is not here, but I don't think it's the end of it. Just that it's gonna make customers, make companies build a more resilient supply chain. I think it's more efficient if somebody specializes in something. You better let him keep doing that, right? There is no point ending that because you never know where the next disruption happens. So it doesn't matter whether I produce in a local factory or in some factories abroad.
In my view, some experts, epidemiologists, geopolitical experts, have been saying for a long time that things can happen, that this hyper-efficient system is at risk and it's fragile. The problem is that the vice presidents responsible for these things cannot spend more money to make them safe. In my view, that has to come from the board. If the board of directors says, hey, what kind of safety stock do I need to keep us safe for this and that contingency, then the supply chain manager can say, well, we can do that for a warehouse over here and this, and it'll cost us so many millions a year. Can anybody imagine what would happen to the supply chain director who, on their own initiative, goes past the CEO to the board, bursts into the board meeting and says, I want to spend $30 million a year? It's just a different point of view. So I think it's really the responsibility of senior management to identify what the risks they want to mitigate for are, and then they can ask the executive committee and the vice presidents for good ideas and how can we do this at some reasonable cost, not the other way around. To me, this is very critical. Alberto, it seems
I would say, Mike, that it's not the end of globalization. And from a health perspective, you can see actually it's the beginning of globalization. So things are pandemics are becoming more global, and the speed of contagion is increased compared with previous diseases. So epidemics or risk become more global. You were mentioning the responsibility of seniors, but also the responsibility as citizens to empower and to renew the trust that maybe in the last decades has been perhaps diminishing a little bit on international organizations, and giving more resources also to the health ministries so that they may become better equipped to face and to tackle this crisis.
Now, Alberto, there's a specific question to you. It seems they've closed the schools in Madrid, I don't know if today or yesterday. Right now.
They have closed the
schools in Madrid.
I didn't know.
Yeah, I didn't know it either because we were getting ready for this webinar.
I didn't know.
Is that should schools close? No. Should we close this institution?
I don't have
You're
an
the
answer.
guy with the public health background, not me. Huh?
I don't have an answer. It seems that the number of the majority of the cases in Spain seems to be concentrated in Madrid and certain. I think it's Torrejón or places. I suppose that the decision has been taken by the relevant authorities of the Madrid region.
But once upon a time, you were in a region. You were responsible for mental health for a very complicated part of the world. Would you have shut down everything there?
Not everything, but places with more risk of contagion, maybe. So I don't have an answer for your question.
By the way, we had a meeting with our dean today, and the IESE Business School is not planning to close anytime soon. We have a contingency plan in place. We have, what happens if a participant cannot come to class, either because they're far away and cannot fly, or they're in quarantine or self-quarantine. We have a second case, what happens if many people cannot come to class. We have a third case, what happens if the professor can't come to class. And we have a fourth case, what happens if we go online. And in fact, I think this is an example of this inventing phase I mentioned earlier. So we have a whole team of people working on making those 4 scenarios possible whenever we need them. Kind of getting ready for what might happen tomorrow. And I think this is just good sense.
Yeah, IESE is not going to close the school unless the authorities in Spain decide that all universities should be closed. I don't know what will be the result. I know that today there was the meeting of all presidents, the rectores or presidents of Spanish universities, and the only point at the agenda of the meeting was coronavirus crisis. I don't know what would be the recommendation to the Ministry of Education and universities.
So I've got one question about cyber. Does anybody want to talk about what happens if this was a cyber virus? I'm not sure any of us are really qualified for that. But, is a human virus the same as a cyber? Or is it from a commerce perspective, is it the same issue?
Well, but this is what happens whenever there's a crisis like this. There is a lot of fake news and fake information, and people just out of sense of a very, very discutable sense of humorism or just to create chaos or whatever, we have this kind of information, and it's a waste of time, and it distracts people from what they have to do. So it's much better not to discuss it.
I mean, there was a question from the audience earlier about, can we trust the numbers coming out of China?
Mm-hmm.
The good news is that China seems to be stabilized. Do we even know if that's true? And you know, I can just say from, you know, I have a class in the IESE Business School. We have students from all over the world, as most of you know. My students from Taiwan don't believe anything that comes from the Chinese mainland. Now, I think they have reasons for that. I mean, this is more historical. Do you believe the numbers coming out of China?
Yeah, so for me, I would say as time goes by, it's going to be easier to verify, because now you have numbers from Italy, you have numbers from Korea. You can pretty much benchmark and cross-validate, right?
Because the curves should be similar somehow.
Exactly. So, but another thing I would say is, all right, if you say you don't believe the number coming from China, then I can pretty much guess which direction you're trying to, like, the biasing the results, right? You're saying probably there are going to be more people infected, or like less people recovered, right? But that's, I think, is a more of a reason for the government or for the company to treat it not lightly, but to treat it seriously, right? If things is only worse than what appears to be, then you have every reason to kind of start preparing it for now.
Yeah, to get back to Axel's point, we know how many people died. We don't really know how many people recovered. Right. And probably that's 90 or 95,000 people so far. So that's, while we're with you, Wei-Ming, if we apply the same time period that you saw in China about factories closing and these kinds of things, and apply that kind of wave of unproductivity across the world,
right?
What does that mean for the global economy? Will things just grind to a halt, or will we be able to keep things going?
I see. So I think I can only answer from a supply chain perspective,
that's the nature
global
of
econ. Yeah, but I think, for example, if you look at Korea, right? They stopped the production of Hyundai, the car, and stuff like that. But the infective cases are pretty much concentrated in one or two locations. It's not like in China. It happened during really unfortunate time during Chinese New Year, so that we have infections across entire China. Well, if the government is able to contain it in certain cities, I don't think the rest of the world is going to get hit as hard as we got hit. Yeah.
Can I say something about lying? I mean,
about lying.
No, sorry. Yeah, you were saying that maybe someone is hiding information. I think this could happen at the very beginning of a crisis. At the very beginning, when the news is known by a small group of people and they don't want to.
And that certainly happened in the first weeks of the crisis in China.
Yeah, but
as far as I can tell from afar.
Exactly. But afterwards, what happens is there are so many people looking into this, and so every eye in the world is looking at the causes, etc., that it's impossible to lie anymore. And also, there's no reason for the other countries to hide information, because that's normal. So this tendency, this temptation of hiding information happens only at the very beginning. So I'm pretty sure that the information we have right now is more or less accurate.
Okay, there's a couple of questions about, Pedro Videla. I think he painted a rather worrying view of the global economy, which I'm not sure all economists would share. But in a down economy, what does that mean? Is there a way to make money in a down economy? Does that mean more consolidation in certain sectors? Does that mean that the guys with a strong balance sheet will be able to eat up their suppliers and their competitors as they go out of business? I don't know. You want to start, Alberto? What do you think about this? Are we going to go into recession?
I think that Mick has already mentioned Walmart or Costco. are making good money these days. How sustainable this will be? There are some people that may benefit of this crisis, some sectors that might be the case. Probably will not be the case for the majority of businesses.
My own view, I think there's always a silver lining, and people who figure out what's happening can probably figure out a path ahead. Alberto, one last question to you, and then I'll kind of go to the panel to kind of close the session. What should an HR professional do if someone in the company is infected?
If someone in the company is infected?
You're HR director of a company, someone is called in, they say they're infected, what should you do next?
Okay, follow the
Follow the protocol.
instructions. Yeah,
What if you don't have a protocol?
You have it. Apply the protocol that's already been made by the WHO and the relevant authorities. So of course this person needs to be at home, not being there, and as much as it's possible, be treated also with confidentiality that deserves.
So maybe the zero step would be to go read those protocols which have been published by the relevant authorities,
of course,
if you haven't done so already.
Yeah.
And I think that
would be first step.
This gets back to Axel's point, which is there is huge amounts of information available if we know how to look for it.
Mm-hmm. Huge amount, which amount I will say of positive and supportive information, and huge amount
of crazy stuff. Yeah.
And crazy stuff. Yeah, but you can resource to this mostly, I said, WHO and the authorities in each country.
So sticking with you, and then we'll go all the way back down. Last words to our panelists. We have an audience here. We have several hundred people on LinkedIn and several hundred people on WebEx. What would you say to people about this situation and what companies can do?
Stay calm. Analyze. Stay calm as a way also of assessing the real risk, but without overestimating.
Iago?
I would like to take one of Albert's suggestions is offer ways to your people to do something about that. It's just to help. You were saying about sharing things and helping others, and this is always very good because in a crisis situation people want to help, and sometimes if we don't offer them how to do that, maybe either they don't help or they help in the wrong way. So if we understand how they can react whenever they want to help others, that would be a very good communications tool.
What you're talking about is involving people in the solution.
Exactly.
Wei Ming?
Yeah, so I think it's a good time for companies to slow down and think about reflect the business model, because usually what they have been doing is that they want to meet the short-term KPIs and really got the time to slow down and think about how they should do business, what are the alternatives. Like nowadays we have driverless cars in Wuhan delivering products because now nobody's on the street, and the companies just take this opportunity to try out new things. I guess this is one of the good times to do that.
Driverless cars on the streets of Wuhan.
Yeah, because there are no other cars.
There's no traffic, so there's very little risk.
No
I guess,
pedestrians.
yeah.
You won't hit nobody, right?
And I think what and for me the issue is again combining these three things, which is to keep people safe, with doing your responsibility to civil society, which is to keep in business, and to your shareholders, which is to try to keep enough cash flow coming through to keep things going. Clearly, digitalization in the broadest sense is something that perhaps can help. There's a lot of ways to do that. A lot of companies have had plans on digital transformation someday, but maybe someday is tomorrow morning in some cases. Anyway, thanks for your attention. Thanks for all your attention online, on WebEx and LinkedIn. And I think we'll close the session here. So thank you for your attention and good night and stay safe.